They erased me from the room before the night even began. No introduction, no name, just a quiet gesture toward an empty seat far from the main table, like I was an afterthought at my own husband's promotion celebration. And when his mother leaned in with that soft smile and said, "Let's not confuse people tonight," I realized they weren't just ignoring me, they were rewriting my place in his life in front of everyone. And the worst part was Daniel didn't say a single word to stop it. He just adjusted his jacket and walked toward the stage, as if I wasn't standing 10 feet behind him, as if I hadn't spent years holding everything together while he built this moment. And in that second, something inside me went completely still, not broken, just quiet, like I already knew this night was going to change everything. And before we go any further, if this story speaks to your heart, only if it truly resonates with you, take a second to subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always read those comments, and it reminds me how many of us have lived through moments like this. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 41 years old, and this was the night my husband got promoted. And the night his entire family learned exactly who I was. But to understand how I ended up standing alone in that room, you need to go back a few years, to a much quieter night, when everything still felt simple, and I believed I had married into a family that would eventually accept me, back when Daniel and I were still new, still learning each other's rhythms, still pretending that the tension at his parents' house was just temporary. I remember the first dinner I had with them, a large suburban house about 20 miles outside the city. Everything perfectly arranged, polished wood floors, framed photos of achievements lining the hallway, his father's military awards displayed like a museum of expectations, and his mother greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She asked polite questions, where I worked, what I did, how busy I usually was, and I gave careful answers, nothing too detailed. Nothing that would draw attention, because that had always been easier. Blending in, staying quiet, letting people assume what they wanted. But I noticed the small things, the way she nodded a little too quickly, the way his brother glanced at me and then away, the way his sister whispered something under her breath when she thought I couldn't hear. It wasn't open hostility. Not at first. It was something quieter, something more controlled. Like they had already decided who I was before I ever sat down at that table. And Daniel, he would squeeze my hand under the table, a silent reassurance, and later he'd say, "They just need time." And I wanted to believe him. I really did. Because I loved him. Because I believed in what we were building together. Because I thought effort would eventually earn respect. But over time, those small moments didn't fade. They sharpened. Comments became more direct. Invitations became selective. Conversations would pause when I entered the room, and I learned how to exist in the space they allowed me, supportive, quiet, present, but never central. And somehow, without ever saying it out loud, that became my role in the family, the woman behind Daniel, the one who smiled, who showed up, who didn't make things complicated. And for a long time, I accepted that, because I thought love meant patience. I thought respect could be built slowly. I thought if I just kept showing up, they would eventually see me. But standing there that night, watching my husband step into the spotlight while I was quietly moved out of it, I realized something I should have understood much earlier. They didn't misunderstand me. They never did. They just never thought I mattered enough to ask. Over time, I stopped expecting them to change and started adjusting myself instead. Not in big ways that anyone would notice, but in small, careful decisions, like choosing simpler clothes when we visited, speaking less at dinner, letting conversations pass without correcting them even when they were wrong about me, because it felt easier to be underestimated than to constantly prove something no one was willing to see. And Daniel, he noticed it too, but he never really challenged it. He would say things like, "They are old school," or "They just do not understand your world." And I told myself that was enough, that love did not need to be loud, that support did not have to be public. But looking back now, I realize silence can be a kind of agreement, and his silence slowly became the loudest thing in the room. There was one evening that stayed with me more than the others, a small family gathering about 6 months before that promotion night. Nothing formal, just dinner at his parents' house. His brother had just closed a business deal and everyone was celebrating him, talking about numbers, contracts, growth, things that sounded impressive but felt distant to me. And at one point, his father turned to Daniel and said, "You are finally stepping into the kind of life this family expects." And then his eyes shifted to me, just for a second, and he added, "Some people adapt, some people do not." He did not say my name, but he did not have to. The table went quiet in that subtle way people do when they all understand something without saying it out loud. And I remember placing my fork down carefully, not because I was upset, but because I did not trust my hands to stay steady, and Daniel just laughed lightly, like it was a harmless comment, like it did not land exactly where it was meant to, and that was the moment something changed in me, not dramatically, not in a way anyone could see, but quietly. I stopped trying to earn a place that was never offered. I stopped explaining myself, stopped hoping that one day they would ask who I really was. Instead, I focused on what I could control: my work, my time, my own sense of direction, and in my world, things were very different. Structure mattered, responsibility mattered, and respect was not given based on appearances or assumptions. It was earned through consistency, through decisions, through showing up when it counted. I had spent years building that kind of life, one where my name meant something in the rooms that mattered, but I never brought that part of me into Daniel's family, not because I was hiding it, but because no one ever asked, and eventually, I let them believe whatever made them comfortable. Maybe I thought it protected the relationship. Maybe I thought it kept things simple. But standing there at that celebration, watching the way they moved around me like I was invisible, I realized something else. They were not just underestimating me, they were relying on that version of me, the quiet one, the one who would not interrupt, the one who would not shift the balance they had created. And that night, every detail made it clearer. The seating arrangement, the way the host greeted Daniel with enthusiasm and glanced past me without a second look, the way his mother introduced distant relatives but skipped over me entirely, even the way the staff handed out programs with his name printed in bold letters while mine was nowhere to be found. It was all intentional in a way that felt almost effortless, like they had rehearsed it without ever saying it out loud. And I stood there, just off to the side of the room, hands loosely at my sides, watching it unfold, not reacting, not correcting, just observing, because for the first time, I was not trying to be included. I was trying to understand exactly how far they were willing to go, and how long Daniel would let it happen without stepping in. And as the room filled with conversation and quiet laughter, as glasses clinked and people took their seats, I realized that whatever happened next was not going to be about proving them wrong. It was going to be about something much simpler, letting the truth arrive on its own, without me forcing it, without me saying a single word. By the time the program officially began, the room had settled into that polished kind of order where everything looked effortless but nothing was accidental. People seated according to status, conversation grouped by importance, and I was placed just far enough away from the center to be seen but not included. And I noticed how naturally it all flowed, how no one questioned it, not even for a second, as if my absence from the narrative had already been agreed upon before anyone arrived. And when the host stepped onto the stage and adjusted the microphone, the room quieted in waves, not instantly, but gradually, like a tide pulling everything inward, and I watched Daniel from where I stood, about 20 feet away, under the soft overhead lights, his posture straight, his expression calm, the version of him that everyone respected, the version I had supported for years. And when his name was announced, there was applause, steady and confident, the kind of applause that assumes success was inevitable, and he walked up to the stage without looking back, not once, not even out of habit, not even by accident, and something about that small detail stayed with me longer than it should have. The absence of a glance, the absence of acknowledgement, as if I had already been edited out of his story, and as he began to speak, his voice carried easily across the room, controlled, practiced, every sentence placed exactly where it needed to be. He thanked his mentors, his colleagues, his family, naming them one by one, each name followed by a nod, a smile, a moment of recognition, and I stood there listening, not expecting anything, but still noticing everything. And when he said, "I built this step by step, through discipline and focus," there was a brief pause, just long enough for the words to settle, and then more applause followed, louder this time, affirming the idea that success was a solo effort, that no one else had carried any part of that weight, and I felt my fingers tighten slightly at my sides, not out of anger, but out of clarity, because in that moment, it was not just omission, It was definition. He was choosing the version of the story he wanted everyone to believe, and the room accepted it without hesitation. And somewhere behind me, I heard his mother's voice, soft but clear enough, "That is how it should be." And a few people nearby nodded, agreeing with a version of reality that excluded me completely. And still, I did not move. I did not interrupt. I did not step forward to correct anything, because something inside me had already shifted earlier that night. I was no longer trying to be included. I was watching, measuring, understanding the full shape of what they were doing. And as his speech continued, I noticed something else, a subtle change in the room that did not match the rest of the energy. It started small, almost invisible. A man seated near the front row, dressed in formal uniform, his posture different from the others, more still, more deliberate, and while everyone else was focused on Daniel, this man was not clapping, not smiling. He was looking across the room, not at the stage, but past it. And it took me a second to realize his attention was fixed on me, not casually, not by coincidence, but with recognition, the kind that does not need confirmation. And for a brief moment, our eyes met, and I saw it clearly. Not surprise, not confusion, but certainty. Like he already knew exactly who I was, and was trying to understand why no one else seemed to. And he leaned slightly toward the person next to him, saying something too quiet to hear, and that was when the shift began. Subtle, almost unnoticeable at first. A pause in the rhythm of the room, a delay between applause, a few heads turning in directions they had not been looking before. And I felt it before I saw it. That thin line where control starts to slip, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to change the atmosphere. And still, Daniel kept speaking, unaware, or maybe choosing not to notice, continuing his speech as if everything was exactly as it should be. And I remained where I was, silent, still, letting the moment unfold on its own, because for the first time that night, the truth was no longer something I needed to reveal. It was something that had just entered the room on its own, and was beginning to move. The shift in the room did not happen all at once. It moved slowly, like a ripple that no one wanted to acknowledge but everyone could feel. Conversations softened. A few people stopped clapping before the rest, and the man in uniform near the front row straightened slightly in his chair, his attention no longer subtle, and I saw him glance toward the stage, then back at me, as if measuring the distance between what was being said and what he knew to be true. And Daniel continued speaking, his voice steady, confident, unaware of the quiet change unfolding behind him, or maybe he felt it but chose to ignore it, because acknowledging it would mean something did not fit, something did not align with the version of the night he had prepared. And as he reached the final part of his speech, thanking those who supported him along the way, there was a pause, just long enough for expectation to exist, just long enough for anyone listening closely to notice who was not named. And then he moved on, closing his remarks with the kind of composure that comes from believing everything is under control. And the applause followed. But it was different now, slightly uneven, like the room was no longer fully in sync, and I could feel eyes shifting, not directly, not obviously, but enough to change the atmosphere. And then the host stepped back onto the stage, smiling, holding a small card in his hand, preparing to continue the program, but he hesitated just for a second, his eyes moving toward the front row where the uniformed man was now standing, and that single movement, that one person rising without announcement, without introduction, was enough to draw attention, subtle at first, then more noticeable, as others followed his line of sight. And the room began to quiet again, not because it was planned, but because something unspoken was happening, and the host adjusted his posture, his tone shifting slightly, as if receiving new information in real time, and I remained where I was, still at the edge of the room, hands relaxed, breathing steady, watching it all unfold without stepping forward. Because there was no need anymore, the moment had already begun to move on its own, and the man in uniform took a few steps forward, not rushing, not dramatic, just deliberate, each step measured, controlled, and when he stopped near the stage, he looked directly at the host, saying something quietly, something that made the host's expression change in a way that was small but unmistakable. And for a brief second, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, not in anticipation, but in confusion, like a script had just been interrupted and no one knew the next line. and Daniel, still on stage, glanced toward them, his smile tightening just slightly, his posture adjusting as if trying to understand what was happening without losing composure. And I saw it then, that thin crack in certainty, the moment where confidence meets something unexpected, and the host nodded slowly, then turned back to the microphone, his voice more careful now, more precise, as if every word suddenly mattered in a different way. And he cleared his throat lightly before speaking again. But before he could continue, the man in uniform shifted his gaze, not toward Daniel, but across the room, directly at me, and it was not a questioning look. It was acknowledgement, clear and undeniable, and I felt the weight of it settle into the space around us, not heavy, not overwhelming, just present, like a truth that had finally been noticed. And one by one, others began to follow that line of sight, turning slightly, adjusting their attention, trying to understand why that focus had moved, and the energy in the room changed again, more noticeably now. Conversation stopped completely, the quiet became absolute, and for the first time that night, I was no longer invisible. Not because I had done anything, not because I had spoken, but because something outside of their control had recognized me, and that recognition was beginning to reshape the entire room. The silence that followed was not loud. It was controlled, stretched thin across the room like something fragile that no one wanted to disturb, and I could feel the weight of every second as the host stood there, holding that card a little tighter now, his eyes moving between the man in uniform and the audience, as if recalibrating in real time. And then he spoke again, slower this time, more deliberate. Before we conclude tonight's program, there is an additional recognition that has just been brought to our attention. And those words alone were enough to shift the energy completely, because nothing about this night had been planned to include anything unexpected, and yet here it was, unfolding anyway, and I saw Daniel turn slightly on stage, his expression still composed but no longer relaxed, his attention no longer on the audience, but searching, trying to understand where this was going, and the host glanced once more toward the man in uniform, receiving a small nod in return. And then his gaze moved across the room until it landed on me, and for the first time that night, I was not being overlooked. I was being addressed, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that cut through everything that had come before. "Colonel Sarah Mitchell," he said, each word distinct, leaving no space for misunderstanding, and for a brief second, nothing moved. Not a chair, not a hand, not even a breath that anyone was willing to release, and I felt it. That exact moment when recognition fully arrived, not gradually, not subtly, but all at once and around me. People shifted, heads turning, eyes narrowing slightly, as they tried to connect what they had just heard with what they thought they knew, and I could see it on their faces, the calculation, the confusion, the quiet realization that something did not match, and Daniel stood completely still, his posture unchanged, but his expression no longer certain, like a single detail had just undone the entire structure he had been standing on. And his mother, seated near the front, leaned forward slightly, her smile gone now, replaced by something tighter, something that did not yet have a name, and I did not move immediately. I did not rush forward or react in any visible way, because there was no urgency in this moment. The truth did not need to be chased. It was already there, filling the room, reshaping it without effort, and as I took a single step forward, measured and steady, I could feel the distance between where I had been standing and where I was now, not just physical distance, but something else entirely, something that could not be reversed, and the man in uniform straightened as I approached, his posture reflecting recognition, not surprise, and when I reached the front of the room, I stopped a few feet from the stage, close enough to be seen clearly, but not close enough to disrupt the structure that was still trying to hold itself together, and the host stepped slightly aside, giving space without needing to be told, and the room remained silent, completely silent now, the kind of silence that does not come from politeness, but from understanding that something important is happening, and no one wants to miss it. And I looked up at Daniel just for a moment, not long enough to create tension, just enough to acknowledge that we were now standing in a different version of the same room, and I saw it in his eyes, not fear, not even shock, but realization, the kind that arrives too late to change anything. And I did not say anything, not yet, because the moment did not belong to words, it belonged to what had already been revealed. and for the first time that night, I was exactly where I had always been, just no longer invisible. After that night, nothing went back to the way it was. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but in quiet, irreversible ways that settled over time like dust, finally finding where it belonged. I did not return to that house for a while. Not out of anger, but because I no longer felt the need to stand in a space that had never truly seen me. And Daniel, he tried to talk, not immediately, not that night, but days later, his voice slower, more careful, like he was choosing each word with a kind of awareness he had never needed before. But by then, something had already shifted inside me, not broken, just clearer, like a line had been drawn that I could finally see, and I realized that love without respect becomes a quiet form of loneliness, the kind that does not make noise but slowly changes who you are. And I was no longer willing to live inside that version of myself, so I stepped back, not in a way that destroyed everything, but in a way that protected what was still mine, my peace, my identity, my sense of direction. And over the following months, life became quieter, not empty, just more honest. I focused on my work, on the people who knew me without needing explanations, on the parts of my life where I did not have to shrink to be accepted. And I began to understand something I wish I had trusted earlier. Your instincts rarely lie. They whisper long before anything breaks. But we often ignore them because we want things to work, because we believe patience will eventually turn into respect. And sometimes it does, but sometimes it does not. And knowing the difference can save you years of silent disappointment. And if there is anything this experience taught me, it is that boundaries are not about pushing people away. They are about standing firm in who you are without needing permission. You do not have to announce your worth for it to exist, and you do not have to stay in spaces where it is constantly questioned. And if you are listening to this and something inside you feels familiar, that quiet discomfort, that sense that you are being overlooked or slowly minimized, I want you to know you are not imagining it, and you are not alone. And more importantly, you are not required to prove your value to people who have already decided not to see it. Protect your time, protect your energy, protect your financial independence. Because stability is not just about money. It is about having the freedom to choose where you stand and who you stand with. And sometimes faith plays a quiet role in all of this, whether you call it God, the universe, or simply your own inner voice. There is something that guides you when you are willing to listen, something that pulls you away from what is not meant for you and toward what is, even when it does not make sense at first. And looking back now, I do not see that night as something that hurt me. I see it as something that revealed everything I needed to know, and for that, I am grateful in a way I did not expect, because clarity is a kind of peace, even when it comes from difficult moments. And if you have stayed with me through this story, truly listened, truly felt it, thank you, not just for your time, but for your presence, for allowing this space to be shared. Because stories like this remind us that we are not as alone as we sometimes feel. And if this resonates with you, you can share your thoughts, your experience, or simply where you are listening from. And if you want to continue hearing stories like this, you can subscribe, not as an obligation, but as a quiet way of staying connected. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I am 41 years old, and the one thing I hope you take from this is simple: never let anyone define your worth in a room where you had to shrink, just to be allowed to stand.